On May 31st, 1889, at roughly 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, a wall of water 60 feet high struck a city of 30,000 people in southwestern Pennsylvania. 57 minutes later, 2,209 of them were dead. That number would not be surpassed as a single-day loss of American civilian life until September 11th, 2001, more than a century later. And the cause of all of it, the engineering failure, the decision that cracked open a lake and sent it down a mountain, came down to fish. Specifically, to a screen placed across a spillway so that the stocked bass in a private lake would not escape into the river below. The richest men in the United States wanted a place to go fishing, and 2,209 people paid for it with their lives. The city was Johnstown, and if you have heard of it at all, you probably know only that it flooded. You may not know what it was before the water came. Johnstown sits at the bottom of the Conemaugh Valley, where the Stony Creek River and the Little Conemaugh meet to form the Conemaugh River, about 60 miles east of Pittsburgh in the Allegheny Mountains. The valley is narrow and steep. The gorge immediately downstream is the deepest east of the Rockies, and the rivers drain a watershed of more than 600 square miles of Appalachian Plateau. It is, by geography, a terrible place to build a city, but it is, by geology, one of the finest places in North America to make steel. The coal was in the hillsides, the limestone was nearby, the iron ore could be shipped in by rail and by canal, and the rivers provided the water that every blast furnace and rolling mill demanded in staggering quantities. So a city grew there anyway, in defiance of the rivers that would eventually take it apart. Joseph Schantz, a Swiss immigrant who anglicized his name to Johns, laid out the first streets in 1800. For its first few decades, Johnstown was a frontier settlement of modest ambition. That changed in 1834, when the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal reached the valley, connecting it to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Suddenly, Johnstown was a waypoint on the most important commercial route in the state. The canal brought traffic, money, and people, and it brought the dam. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania built the South Fork Dam between 1838 and 1853, high in the mountains 14 miles upstream of Johnstown. The dam's purpose was simple. It created a reservoir to feed water into the western division of the canal system. When completed, it was the largest earthen dam in the United States, 931 feet long, 72 feet high, holding back a lake 2 miles long and a mile wide, with a depth of 60 feet near the breast. The lake sat 450 feet above Johnstown in elevation. The dam was engineered with 5 cast iron discharge pipes at its base, each 2 feet in diameter, controlled by valves that allowed operators to lower the water level whenever they needed. It also had a wide stone spillway cut into the rock on one end and a secondary emergency spillway on the western abutment. By the engineering standards of the day, it was a sound piece of work. But within 2 years of its completion, the canal was obsolete. The Pennsylvania Railroad had crossed the mountains, and freight that once took weeks by barge now moved in days by rail. The Commonwealth sold the entire canal system to the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1857. The railroad had no use for a reservoir feeding a canal nobody traveled. The dam and lake became surplus property, neglected, and largely forgotten. The discharge pipes were eventually sold for scrap. The dam partially failed in 1862, draining the reservoir. But since nobody was killed and the property had little value, no one rebuilt it. For nearly 2 decades, the broken dam sat open to the weather, its stonework crumbling, its engineering abandoned. And then a man named Benjamin Franklin Ruff had an idea. Ruff was a Pittsburgh speculator, not one of the great industrialists himself, but a man who moved in their circles, who understood what the very rich wanted and how to sell it to them. In 1879, he purchased the ruined dam and its surrounding acreage from a former congressman, then immediately turned around and offered it to a group of Pittsburgh's wealthiest men as the site for a private resort. His pitch was elegant. The mountains were cool in summer, the lake could be restocked, the shooting was excellent, and the location was just a train ride from the heat, soot, and noise of Pittsburgh. For men who spent their days running steel mills and coke furnaces and railroad empires, a quiet retreat in the Alleghenies was worth almost any price. Henry Clay Frick was the first to sign on. Frick, then 30 years old and already known as the Coke King of Pennsylvania, was Ruff's friend and the key to recruiting the rest of Pittsburgh's elite. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was formally organized in 1879 and incorporated under Pennsylvania law. Ruff rebuilt the dam, after a fashion, and the reservoir refilled to become Lake Conemaugh. A 47-room clubhouse went up with a dining room that could seat 150. Members built private cottages along the lakeshore, some in the Queen Anne style, some in the East Lake. Stables, boathouses, and walking paths followed. The membership roster eventually reached 61 names, and it read like a directory of American capitalism. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, Philander Knox, Henry Phipps, Robert Pitcairn of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Thaw banking family, the Moorheads, the Reeds. These were not merely rich men. These were the men who were building the American industrial economy from the ground up. Men whose decisions about steel production, railroad routes, and financial instruments shaped the daily lives of millions. The membership fee was reportedly around $800, roughly $25,000 in today's money, with annual dues of roughly $100 on top of that. A chauffeur would meet arriving members at the South Fork train station and drive them to the lake by carriage, pausing on top of the dam itself so guests could take in the view. That pause on the dam, incidentally, was one reason Ruff lowered it. The top had originally been narrow, and two carriages could not pass each other. By shaving 3 feet off the dam's crest, Ruff widened the road surface. The fact that those 3 feet also reduced the dam's capacity to contain water seems not to have troubled him. The modifications Ruff made to the dam were, by any engineering standard, catastrophic. He lowered the crest by as much as 3 feet. He never replaced the cast iron discharge pipes, which meant the club had no way to lower the lake level in an emergency, and he placed iron fish screens across the main spillway, heavy mesh grates designed to keep the stocked black bass from escaping downstream. Those screens would catch debris during heavy rains, effectively choking the spillway, the dam's primary safety valve. A 2016 hydraulic analysis published in the journal Helion confirmed what engineers had suspected for over a century. The modifications made by the South Fork Club cut the dam's safe discharge capacity roughly in half. Not everyone was blind to the danger. 14 miles downstream, a man named Daniel J. Morrell understood exactly what was sitting above his city. Morrell was, by any measure, the most important person in Johnstown's history. A Philadelphia Quaker who had arrived in the 1850s, he served as general manager of the Cambria Iron Company for nearly 30 years, transforming it from a struggling ironworks into one of the largest steel producers in the United States. By the 1880s, Cambria Iron had approximately $1.45 billion in facilities, adjusted for inflation, spread across the Johnstown Valley. The company had pioneered the use of the Bessemer process for American steelmaking and rolled the first steel rails for commercial use in the country. Morrell also ran Johnstown's first national bank, the local gas and water company, and the city council. He served 2 terms in the U.S. Congress. Andrew Carnegie had once worked under him. This was not a man whose concerns could be brushed aside. When Ruff began rebuilding the dam in 1879, Morrell paid attention. He sent his top engineer, John Fulton, a man with training in both engineering and geology, to inspect the work. Fulton visited the dam site in November 1880, toured it with club officers, and came back with bad news. The reconstruction was shoddy. The materials were substandard. There was no mechanism to control the water level. Morrell wrote to Ruff directly, calling the dam a perpetual menace to the lives and property of those residing in the upper valley of the Conemaugh. He urged that the discharge pipes be restored and offered to have Cambria Iron help pay for proper repairs. Ruff's reply was curt. "You and your people are in no danger from our enterprise." The matter was dropped. Morrell, still trying to influence the club from within, had purchased his own membership, hoping to push for renovations as a fellow member rather than an outside critic. His plan might have worked, given enough time. But Daniel Morrell died in 1885 at the age of 64. His club membership was transferred to Cyrus Elder, Cambria Iron's chief counsel. Elder tried to continue the campaign, but he lacked Morrell's authority and connections. 2 years after Morrell, Benjamin Ruff also died. The dam remained as Ruff had built it, and the fish screens remained in the spillway. For the next 4 years, the dam held. There were close calls, moments during spring rains when the water crept dangerously near the top. But each time it held, and each time it held, the people of Johnstown grew a little more accustomed to the idea that the warnings were overblown. False alarms do more damage than most people appreciate. They don't just waste effort, they erode the instinct to act. By the spring of 1889, the phrase, "the dam might break," had become something of a local joke. Meanwhile, Johnstown itself was booming. The city's population had grown from just 1,269 in 1850 to nearly 30,000 by 1889. Cambria Iron employed thousands and had attracted waves of Welsh, German, Swedish, Scottish, and Hungarian immigrants who settled in tight-knit neighborhoods along the valley floor and up the hillsides. The Gautier Works, a subsidiary plant in the adjacent borough of Wood Vale, was one of the country's leading producers of barbed wire. Miles of it rolling off the production line every week, shipped west to fence the open plains. The steel mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, both to keep up with demand, and because the blast furnaces could not be allowed to cool. Morrell had fashioned Johnstown into a classic company town. Cambria Iron owned the coal mines that fueled the furnaces, the coke works that processed the coal, 800 frame houses rented to workers, a company store that sold goods at near cost, a hospital, and a night school. The company had even built the public library. The city had 36 churches, 20 schools, 2 opera houses, a roller skating rink, and a park. The Hulbert House, a well-known hotel popular with traveling salesmen, stood near the center of town. Its proprietor, Mr. Benford, rented rooms to young teachers and visiting businessmen from Philadelphia and beyond. Just down the block, Gottlieb Bantley had run a hardware store at 121 Clinton Street since 1861, through the Civil War and every spring flood since. Stores and offices lined Main Street. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran through the valley floor, connecting Johnstown to Pittsburgh and points east. At the downstream end of town, the railroad stone bridge, built just 2 years earlier in 1887, carried 3 tracks across the Conemaugh on 7 massive stone arches. It was an imposing piece of engineering, solid enough that the railroad expected it to last a century. It would prove them right, though not in the way anyone intended. This was a real city, built on real industry, and the people who lived there had every reason to believe it would continue to grow. But Johnstown was squeezed. The narrow valley left little room for expansion, and both the railroad and the iron company had dumped slag and waste into the riverbeds, narrowing the channels further. The hillsides had been stripped of timber for lumber and fuel, increasing runoff. Every spring the streets flooded to one degree or another. People moved their furniture upstairs, waited it out, and moved it back down. Flooding was a nuisance, not a crisis. This was the logic that killed them. On May 28, 1889, a low-pressure system formed over Nebraska and Kansas. By the time it reached western Pennsylvania 2 days later, it had grown into what the U.S. Army Signal Corps would call the heaviest rainfall event ever recorded in that region, 6 to 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. On the evening of May 30th, it began to pour. It rained through the night and into the morning of the 31st. Johnstown held its Memorial Day parade on the 30th. The rain let up just long enough, but by the morning of the 31st, streets were under 2 to 7 feet of water. People moved their carpets and furniture upstairs, as they always did. Businesses sent workers home early. Nobody panicked. This had happened before. 14 miles above town, Elias Unger, a retired Pittsburgh hotel owner who served as president of the South Fork Club, woke at the lake to a sight that made his stomach drop. Lake Conemaugh was swollen from the night's rain, and the water was nearly cresting the dam. Unger ran outside and assembled every man he could find. Some tried to unclog the spillway, where the fish screens and a broken fish trap had become jammed with debris carried in by the swollen water line. Others dug a ditch on the western abutment to create an additional outlet. Still others piled mud and rock on the dam's crest, trying to raise it above the water. The work was desperate, improvised, and ultimately futile. The dam was not engineered to be saved by hand labor in a rainstorm. Twice that morning, the club's engineer, John Park, rode on horseback to a telegraph office in the nearby town of South Fork to send warnings to Johnstown. The messages were sent, but they were not delivered with any urgency. There had been too many false alarms over the years. People downstream heard the dam might go, the way you hear a car alarm in a parking lot. An annoyance, not information. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, Unger ordered his men to abandon their efforts and fall back to high ground on either side of the dam. There was nothing left to do but watch. Between 2:50 and 2:55 p.m., the South Fork Dam breached. The lake held 14.55 million cubic meters of water, roughly 3.8 billion gallons. Modern analysis suggests the lake took about 65 minutes to empty, though eyewitnesses at the time thought it was faster, between 35 and 45 minutes. The resulting flow rate through the narrow valley temporarily equaled the average flow rate of the Mississippi River at its delta. Pause on that for a moment. The entire volume of a mountain lake compressed into a narrow Appalachian valley, flowing at the rate of the Mississippi. The first town in its path was South Fork, but most of it sat on high ground, and the residents saw the water coming in time to run for the hills. Between 20 and 30 houses were destroyed, and 4 people died. The wave rolled on, picking up trees, houses, barns, livestock, and people. At the Conemaugh Viaduct, a 78-foot railroad bridge, the flood temporarily dammed against the stone arch, debris jamming the opening. The bridge held for 7 minutes. When it collapsed, it released a renewed surge, and the small village of Mineral Point took the full force. When the water receded, Mineral Point was gone, not damaged, gone. There were no buildings, no topsoil, no subsoil, only bedrock. 16 people dead. The flood hit East Conemaugh next, a railroad town in the valley. Here, one of the day's few acts of effective warning took place. A locomotive engineer named John Hess heard the rumble of the approaching wave, threw his engine into reverse, and raced backward toward town, with his whistle shrieking without pause. His warning saved many lives. Others were not so lucky. The wave picked up Hess's locomotive and tossed it aside like a toy. At least 50 people died in East Conemaugh, including about 25 passengers stranded on trains. Then the wave hit Woodvale, where Cambria Iron's Gautier Works stood. This is the detail that turned a catastrophic flood into something almost beyond description. The Gautier Works manufactured barbed wire, miles and miles of it, coiled and stored on the factory floor. When the flood tore through the plant, it swept up that wire and tangled it into the mass of debris. From that point forward, the flood was not just water and wreckage. It was water, wreckage, and barbed wire. People pulled from the water were found with wire wound around their bodies so tightly it had cut to the bone. Of Woodvale's 1,100 residents, 314 died. At 4:07 p.m., 57 minutes after the dam collapsed, the flood reached Johnstown. One survivor in Cambria City described it simply. In 15 minutes, the water rose 10 feet, and in 5 minutes more, I am sure 50 houses came floating down the streets. There were people in every one of them. When he looked back, he said, "Where Cambria City stood there was nothing but a great lake of water." The streets, already flooded to several feet, grew black with people running for their lives, another witness recalled from a hillside above. Some made it to high ground, many did not. Those caught by the wave found themselves in a torrent of oily brown water traveling at 40 miles per hour, surrounded by tons of grinding debris. Entire houses, railroad cars, trees, machinery, animals. Some were crushed instantly. Others were tangled in the barbed wire that now laced through everything. Others rode the wreckage, clinging to rooftops and timbers for minutes or hours. 6-year-old Gertrude Quinn was swept from her family when the water hit. She found herself on a floating mattress, hurtling down what had been Main Street. She passed a rooftop where dozens of people huddled, calling to them for help. A man jumped into the churning water, reached the mattress, and climbed aboard. Eventually, as the mattress drifted near higher ground, someone on the bank threw Gertrude through the air to waiting arms on shore. She would survive, marry, and publish a memoir of the experience nearly 50 years later. Not everyone had Gertrude's luck. Anna Fenn Maxwell's husband was washed away by the initial surge. She was trapped in their home with 7 children as the water rose. Maxwell survived. All 7 children drowned. William Varner, whose wife had died just 3 weeks before the flood, lost 6 of his children while saving his 18-month-old baby. An elderly German couple floated on their house for miles before snagging in a tree where they clung for 24 hours. Their 5 daughters were dead. And then came the stone bridge. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Stone Bridge, a 7-arched structure built of solid masonry in 1887, carried the railroad across the Conemaugh River at the downstream edge of Johnstown. It was, ironically, the only bridge strong enough to survive the flood, and its survival made the disaster worse. The immense mass of debris carried by the water, twisted steel rails, boxcars, entire buildings, trees, the bodies of the dead, and everywhere the barbed wire, slammed into the bridge's arches and stuck. The bridge held, but it created a temporary dam. The debris pile grew to 30 acres in extent and rose to 70 feet in places. Survivors trapped in the wreckage began to scramble across the heap toward shore, but many were pinned, caught in the wire, unable to move. Then the debris caught fire. Oil from wrecked tanks and locomotives had saturated the pile. When it ignited, likely from overturned stoves or ruptured gas lines, the flames spread across the entire 30-acre mass. 80 people who had survived the water died in the fire, some still trapped in the wreckage of their own homes. The fire burned for 3 days. Survivors on the hillsides watched through the night as the glow illuminated the valley and the screams of the trapped carried across the water. Attorney James Walters described riding his own house down the flooded streets until it struck Alma Hall, throwing him into his second-floor office. He found roughly 200 survivors sheltering in the hall's upper floors. They organized themselves in total darkness, electing Walters as president. A doctor with several crushed ribs managed the wounded. 2 women gave premature birth during the night. By the following day, women and children were dying from shock and exhaustion. The official death toll was 2,209, later revised to 2,208 after a man named Leroy Temple, reported as dead, resurfaced 11 years later in Beverly, Massachusetts. He had pulled himself from the debris at the Stone Bridge, walked out of the valley, and simply started a new life elsewhere. 99 entire families were wiped out. 396 children were killed. 777 bodies were never identified. They were buried in a 20,000-square-foot plot at Grandview Cemetery on a bluff above the city, the kind of high ground that would have saved any of them had they been standing on it that afternoon instead of down in town. Each grave is marked with an identical white marble headstone bearing no name, a 21-foot granite monument erected in 1892 and topped with allegorical figures of faith, hope, and charity stands at the head of the plot. Bodies were recovered as far away as Cincinnati, Ohio. The last one was found in 1911, 22 years after the flood. The damage was estimated at $17 million, roughly $540 million today. 1,600 homes were destroyed. 4 square miles of downtown Johnstown were obliterated. The news hit the country like a physical blow. On June 1st, Americans woke to banner headlines in every major newspaper describing the worst inland flood in the nation's history. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World commissioned Walt Whitman, then 70 years old and living in Camden, New Jersey, to write a poem for the front page. Whitman claimed to have written A Voice from Death in an hour and a half, deeply moved by reports of what had happened to a working-class city. Photographers descended on the valley within days, producing stereograph cards and large-format images that became some of the first widely distributed disaster photography in American history. Within a week, books about the flood were being printed and sold on the streets of New York. Yet the first response was staggeringly fast. Working 7 days and 7 nights, railroad crews built a temporary trestle bridge to replace the destroyed Conemaugh Viaduct, and the Pennsylvania Railroad restored service to Pittsburgh, 55 miles away, by June 2nd, 2 days after the flood. Coffins and undertakers were the first things Johnstown requested from the outside world. Clara Barton, the 67-year-old founder of the American Red Cross, arrived on June 5th with 50 volunteers. It was the organization's first major disaster relief effort. The Red Cross had existed for only 8 years and had never been tested at this scale. Barton stayed for 5 months. Her team built temporary hotels, set up warehouses for donated supplies, provided medical care, and helped house more than 25,000 people. Donations poured in from across the country and from 18 foreign nations, totaling $3.7 million, more than $100 million in today's dollars. The people of Johnstown, when Barton finally left in October, gave her a gold pin set with diamonds and amethysts as a farewell gift. 3 years later, Johnstown would send $2,596 to Barton to help with her relief efforts during the Russian famine. Cambria Iron reopened its less damaged lower works by June 6th, 6 days after the flood. The Gautier Works in Woodvale was a total loss and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Within 18 months, Cambria Iron had returned to full production. There is something almost brutal in that efficiency. The same industrial energy that had built the city simply rebuilt it, as if the flood were an engineering problem rather than a human catastrophe. And what of the men who owned the dam? Survivors filed lawsuits against the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The case should have been simple. A club of millionaires had bought a dam, crippled its safety features, ignored an expert warning, and 2,209 people had died as a direct result. But the law of 1889 was not the law of today. The club was defended in court by the firm of Knox and Reed, whose senior partners, Philander Knox and James Hay Reed, were both members of the club. Knox would later serve as U.S. Secretary of State and twice as a United States Senator. The defense argued that the dam's failure was a natural disaster, an act of God. The courts agreed. No legal compensation was ever paid to any survivor or any family of the dead. Cyrus Elder, the Cambria Iron lawyer who had inherited Daniel Morrell's club membership and tried to continue his campaign for repairs, survived the flood. His wife and daughter did not. He spent the rest of his life in Johnstown, still working for the company, still writing, still living in a city that the club he had joined in an attempt to save it had helped destroy. The club's financial structure made individual liability nearly impossible to establish. The dam was owned by the corporation, not by the members personally, and proving that any particular member had been negligent in maintaining a dam he had likely never inspected was, under the legal standards of the day, almost impossible. The American Society of Civil Engineers launched an investigation 5 days after the flood, but the 4-member committee, led by the esteemed hydraulic engineer James B. Francis, completed their report in January 1890 and then sealed it. At the ASCE's convention that June, committee member Max Becker explained the delay. We will hardly publish our report this session unless pressed to do so, as we do not want to become involved in any litigation. The report was not released publicly until June 1891, more than 2 years after the disaster. When it finally appeared, it concluded that the dam would have failed even if maintained to its original specifications, a finding that modern hydraulic analysis has directly contradicted. The new ASCE president, who oversaw the report's suppression, William Shin, was a former partner of Andrew Carnegie. The case became a landmark, however, not for its outcome, but for its outrage. In the years following the Johnstown flood, state courts across the country began adopting the British common law precedent of Rylands versus Fletcher, which held that a property owner could be held strictly liable for damage caused by the unnatural use of land, regardless of negligence. The dead of Johnstown had not achieved justice, but they had inadvertently changed the law. Andrew Carnegie donated money to rebuild a library in Johnstown. The building went up in 1891, a handsome 3-story brick structure in the French Gothic style, funded by Carnegie and Cambria Iron. It is still standing. Today it houses the Johnstown Flood Museum. There is something in that fact that resists easy interpretation. The library, funded by a man whose fishing club killed 2,209 people, now used to tell the story of how those 2,209 people died. As for the lake, in the early 1900s, trustees for the defunct South Fork Club sold the old resort site to the Maryland Coal Company. Maryland Coal promptly dug mine shafts, built a town called St. Michael on the former lake bed, and laid a rail spur through the breach in the dam to reach its mines. Some of the tycoons' cottages were demolished. Others were repurposed as houses for mine executives. The clubhouse became a hotel. Lake Conemaugh, which had been 2 miles long and a mile wide, was gone. Today, the dam's remnants and the empty lake bed are preserved as the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, a unit of the National Park Service. 75,000 people visit each year. The breach in the dam is still clearly visible, a wide notch in the earthen wall, now covered with trees. But the story of Johnstown did not end with the rebuilding. If anything, the most disorienting part of Johnstown's history is what happened next. The city rebuilt itself with extraordinary speed. By 1894, an observer would have been hard-pressed to see evidence of the destruction. Population continued to grow. Cambria Iron reorganized as the Cambria Steel Company in 1898, expanded its facilities, and by the early 20th century, Johnstown's mills stretched 13 miles along the rivers. Immigrants from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Italy, and elsewhere flooded in to work the furnaces and the mines. The population peaked at roughly 67,000 in the 1920s. Johnstown was the 9th largest city in Pennsylvania. Then Bethlehem Steel bought Cambria in 1923, and the long, slow contraction began. Bethlehem modernized some facilities but retired others. Other steelmaking centers, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, gained market share. The Great Depression hit the steel towns hard, and in 1936, on St. Patrick's Day, Johnstown flooded again. 24 people died. President Franklin Roosevelt pledged federal money to ensure it would never happen again. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spent 5 years dredging the Conemaugh and encasing the riverbanks in concrete walls nearly 20 feet deep. Upon completion, the Corps declared Johnstown flood-free. The phrase held for 35 years. On the night of July 19, 1977, a severe thunderstorm dropped 11 inches of rain in 8 hours on the watershed above the city. The rivers rose over the concrete walls. The Laurel Run Dam, upstream, failed. By dawn, the city was under 8 feet of water. 78 people died. 50,000 were left homeless. Property damage reached $200 million. Markers on the corner of City Hall at 401 Main Street show the high water marks of all 3 floods, 1889, 1936, and 1977. 3 lines on a wall, each one a catastrophe. Johnstown was declared flood-free and then flooded. It was rebuilt and then deindustrialized. By 1973, Bethlehem Steel was the region's biggest employer, with 11,800 workers. By 1982, the payroll had withered to 2,100. The final blow came in 1992, when Bethlehem shuttered its Johnstown works entirely. The same year, the city was officially designated as financially distressed under Pennsylvania's Act 47. Over 12,000 jobs disappeared from a city that had once produced 2 million tons of steel per year and now produced none. The population fell from 67,000 at its peak to roughly 18,000 today. Over 40% of properties are vacant or abandoned. The mill complex that once ran 13 miles along the rivers is mostly gone. A few buildings from the oldest section, the lower works, dating to the 1860s, still stand along the Conemaugh, preserved as a National Historic Landmark. The blacksmith shop, built around 1864, is the most historically significant survivor. It is vacant. A few blocks away, the stone bridge still carries railroad tracks across the river. It is owned by Norfolk Southern now. It has been reinforced with concrete. It held in 1889, and it held in 1936, and it held in 1977. It is perhaps the most durable structure in Johnstown, the thing that will not break, the thing that held when the rest of the city gave way, and that held the wreckage and the fire and the dead. Johnstown shed its financially distressed designation in 2023, after more than 3 decades under state oversight. There are signs of careful, modest revival. Heritage tourism centered on the flood and the steel history, some small-scale manufacturing, a few new restaurants in the Cambria City neighborhood. The inclined plane, built in 1891 to carry people and vehicles from the valley floor to the hilltop neighborhood of Westmont, still runs. It is marketed accurately as the steepest vehicular inclined plane in the world. From the top, on a clear day, you can see the whole valley, the rivers, the bridges, the place where the mills used to be, the neighborhoods climbing the hillsides. It is a handsome view of a city that has been knocked down more times than any American city should have to endure. The question that the Johnstown story raises is not really about flood control or dam safety or even the negligence of the rich. It is something more uncomfortable than any of those. In the 1880s, the Cambria Iron Company had roughly $1.45 billion in assets in the valley. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club owned a dam 14 miles upstream and could have been made to repair it properly for a few $1,000s. The cost of restoring the discharge pipes, clearing the fish screens, and raising the dam back to its original height. Daniel Morrell, the most powerful man in the valley, offered to help pay for the work. The club refused. Morrell died. The dam broke. 2,209 people died. The club's lawyers argued successfully that it was an act of God. The richest men in America walked away. The discharge pipes had been removed and sold for scrap. The dam had been lowered so carriages could cross it. The fish screens had been placed in the spillway so the base wouldn't escape. None of these were acts of malice. They were acts of convenience, made by men who did not live downstream, who summered at the lake for a few weeks each year, and who understood the dam as part of their property rather than as a structure holding 20 million tons of water above a city of 30,000 people. The gap between those two understandings, the dam as real estate and the dam as threat, is the entire story. Today at Grandview Cemetery, on the bluff above Johnstown, the 777 identical white headstones stand in rows across their 20,000 square foot plot. No names, no dates, no ages. Just stone after stone after stone, marking the places where unidentified men, women, and children were buried in the weeks after the water receded. Some were infants. Some were grandparents. Some were visitors, like Maggie Irwin, an 18-year-old who had come to Johnstown just 2 days before the flood to work at the Hulbert House Hotel, supporting her widowed mother and 9 siblings back home. Her body was recovered, but her family could not afford a headstone. She lies among the unknowns. At the far end of the plot, the granite monument rises 21 feet. Faith, hope, and charity look out over the valley. Below them, somewhere under the carefully mowed grass, Maggie Irwin and 776 others lie in the ground that the Cambria Iron Company sold to the Cemetery Association 4 years before the flood. The dam that killed them was 14 miles upstream. The men who owned the dam lived 60 miles away in Pittsburgh. The fish screens that clog the spillway are long gone, along with the spillway and the dam and the lake and the club and the cottages and the men who built them. Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Henry Clay Frick died the same year in his mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York. Andrew Mellon died in 1937. Philander Knox, the club's own lawyer who argued the case was an act of God, died in 1921, having served as Secretary of State under 2 presidents. None of them ever spent a day in court over the 2,209 dead. None of them ever paid $1 in damages. The poem that circulated in the weeks after the flood had it right, though it took a verse to say what could be said in a sentence, all of it. The water, the wire, the fire at the bridge, the 777 unnamed graves, the families destroyed whole, all of it was the price that was paid for fish. A 6-year-old girl on a mattress. A locomotive engineer with his whistle screaming. A dam lowered for carriages. Screens in a spillway for bass. A letter from a dead man warning of exactly what would happen. A reply. You and your people are in no danger from our enterprise. Grandview Cemetery is open daily. The plot of the unknowns is near the entrance. Take a right, and you will see it before you reach the first corner. The headstones are very white against the grass. There are 777 of them, though 22 were added for symmetry. The monument stands at the head of the rows. Faith, hope, and charity, carved in Vermont granite, weighing 35 tons. They do not look down at the graves. They look out over the valley, toward the place where the water came from.